Good afternoon and welcome to Lunchtime Shares with me, Kevin Britz, proudly powered by leadershipbydesign.co, where we aim to add value to people's lives. You can catch us live every Wednesday and Thursday at lunchtime on ebizradio.com, and where we talk about everything leadership coaching and marketing. And you can catch the Lunchtime series on all your major podcast channels today. In our marketing and leadership segment, as per usual, our marketing and communications expert and co-host, Craig Pagely. How are you doing, Craig?
Kevin, I'm great. Thank you very much. Yeah, good to be chatting again. It was an incredibly active sport-filled weekend with the Proteas cricket team coming back from 2-0 down to beat Australia, 3-2 in the ODI series, which is a good warm-up for the World Cup, which is around the corner. And then obviously the Springboks scoring a bonus point in their pool game against Romania, which was really, really quite epic, and some wonderful play, but also some expected scrappy play in these kinds of games.
Yeah, like what was interesting about watching the Romania and South Africa game was it was almost like watching a primary school rugby team play a high school rugby. And maybe that's a terrible analogy, but what you could see was what I really took away from the game was you can see why South Africa is a really impeccable, amazing, kick-ass rugby team. They, like when it comes to their lineouts, when it comes to their scrumming, when it comes to their support, when it comes to even their rucks, the mauls, that ongoing kind of process they kept making happen, creating the gaps for people to score like they did. And dummy, the amount of dummies that they had and then scored as well. I was like, that's incredibly good rugby. And that's what's, I think those little things that differentiate like really great teams from, teams that are trying to play well.
I'm quite impressed at the terminology you're using, Kevin, for someone who hasn't really watched the sport much.
I used to play rugby, Kramer. I used to play rugby when I was in high school.
All, and you just talking straight into it. That's brilliant, and it's great to appreciate. Yeah, you have to give Romania everything. They had some damn fine moves. They're a tenacious bunch, and it's inevitable that the big teams are going to give them a bit of a hiding. But gosh, the fact that they're in the World Cup final ahead of the likes of USA and Canada, who were there last year, fantastic achievement.
But also, what I'm looking forward to is in comparison or like having a comparative to how, if you see Romania when we play Ireland, or when we played Scotland, we still nailed and kicked ass in so many ways when we played Scotland. Right, so to have that comparative throughout the games, it's going to be nice to see, how good South Africa is at keeping the consistency of that top-notch kind of team working together at every single moment. And that's the kind of experience that I had with this game, was that they, at every next call and sort of point that they had, they came out like guns are blazing kind of thing.
Yes,
And I think
absolutely.
That consistency really, if they do that throughout the World Cup, I think we're gonna be very, very pleasantly surprised.
And closing the World Cup from my side, obviously you've got to watch on Sunday evening, because that's the pivotal game so far in the World Cup, and really will determine which route we go and who we meet in the quarterfinals. So
it's going to be a biggie. Yeah, absolutely.
Yes.
So great. With all of the sports behind us, what are the key reminders from that we can share from our last week's conversation?
Kevin, thanks. Last week we discussed the role that storytelling plays in the world of advertising communications, and how marketers can actually leverage this to build salience for their brands. But before referencing the article in question, I just want to look at one of those definitions that we looked at last week on storytelling, as it has relevance to the world of marketing and advertising. So according to attest.com, which is a consumer research platform, storytelling in marketing means using a narrative to communicate a message. It can be useful for everyone from small startups to larger corporations. And the aim here is to make the viewer feel something, and enough that it will inspire them to take action and to increase their brand loyalty. So moving on to the key reminder points, Kevin, these are from the article titled The Power of Storytelling for Your Business, Unleashing Your Inner Storyteller. The article was written by Candice Georgiadis and was published to the Young Entrepreneurs Council, at least by the Young Entrepreneurs Council, to Forbes.com. So point one notes that know your audience and their pain points. So research and profile your ideal customers and understand their needs, wants, challenges, goals, desires, fears, frustrations, and obviously aspirations. Point two is define your core message and value proposition. You need to clarify what you want to say and why it matters to that audience. What are the main points or benefits of your story? And apply this lovely simple formula. Your brand helps your audience solve their problems by your solution. Point three is choose the right format and channel for your story. Use different types of stories and media formats for different purposes and platforms. And consider where your audience is online and what kind of content they like to consume, Kevin. Point four is use the classic storytelling structure of setup, conflict, and resolution. Yeah, you can introduce your characters, namely your brand and your audience, the situation, your specific audience's problems, needs, or challenge, and the goal, namely your audience's desired outcome. Present the obstacles or difficulties that prevent them from achieving their goals, namely your competitors, market conditions, internal issues, etc. And show how your character overcomes the conflicts and helps them reach the goal, namely your solution, the value proposition, and the call to action. And then the final point is incorporate sensory details and emotions, vitally important. And this you can do by using descriptive language that appeals to your audience's sense and emotions. Paint this vivid picture of your story in their mind and use those sensory details that actually involve sight, sound, smell, touch, and taste, and draw the audience into the emotions, Kevin. And those are the key reminder points from last week's conversation.
Fantastic. Guys, so if you want to check that out, go and check it out, Storytelling, on the YouTube channel and on all your major podcast channels. You can check out the Lunchtime series and the shows, and all the podcasts will be there. Great. So what have we got in store for today's conversation?
So Kevin, I want to, you know me, I like to sort of theme and thread these things together. So I want to cover a parallel topic to storytelling this week, namely that of how we actually get and retain people's attention through the written word, if at all possible. And I came across a fascinating article on Fast Company titled, Harvard Researchers Explain How Your Brains Skim Information and How to Actually Get People's Attention. And the underlying findings of the study identify that while skimming is faster than reading, it also leaves us susceptible to missing information, Kevin. An important point to note when the story being told actually requires this intentional engagement and connection of the words being presented.
So, Craig, I mean, I know what skimming is, but what on earth is skimming, Craig? Tell us.
Kevin, it's in this context, it's got nothing to do with money or betting. Okay, but jokes aside, it's a term that I thought I had a fairly good understanding of, but soon realized that I actually had no idea about the depth of the term and the findings that the study actually referenced in the article, Kevin. But before getting into those findings, it definitely warrants a review of the definition of the term skimming. So according to the Oxford Dictionary, skimming is an action of reading something quickly so as to note only the important points. Okay. According to literarydevices.net, skimming is a reading technique meant to look for main or general ideas in a text without going into detailed and exhaustive reading. And in skimming, a reader reads only important information, but nothing else. And this technique works effectively in non-fiction materials, newspapers, and long novels. And does that match with what your interpretation of skimming is, Kevin?
Yeah, so from a neuroscience perspective, what the brain does is generalize, delete, and distort information. So to make sense of it, like the data that your brain's perceiving at any given time, your brain wants to get to the information that it's seeing or experiencing or collecting, the data that it's actually collecting. And it wants to make sense of it as quickly as possible. So what we generally do is, and that's how speed reading actually works. You don't only start connecting words together, you start deleting words like the and to and because just to shorten the information so that it gets to your head quicker. So yeah, it's, from a brain science perspective, that's exactly what it does. It just quickens the way of how you can actually pick up information.
Brilliant. So then
But it's
moving
also,
on from,
sorry, it's also a brilliant skill. Like that's why speed reading becomes because you have to unlearn the way you learn information when you do speed reading, which is quite difficult. But when you know how to do that, you learn how to skim over information quick enough for you to pick up an entire sentence instead of one word at a time. But your brain literally has to unlearn the strategy, and by skimming information, you start learning big chunks of information at once. So it can be a very useful skill, but your brain has to unlearn the old way of learning.
I think that's definitely a course I need to go and investigate, because it's the one thing that's always appealed to me is the rate at which some people read. It just blows my mind. But moving on from the definitions, I want to get back to the article, which was actually written by Todd Rogers and Jessica Lasky-Kink. It was published to fastcompany.com on the 12th of September this year, so a very current article. And then to provide some context here, Todd Rogers is professor of public policy at Harvard University. He has a behavioral science degree and co-founder of the Analyst Institute and Everyday Labs. We've actually come across them before in one of our previous articles. And Jessica Lasky-Kink is the research director at the People Lab, also based at the Harvard Kennedy School. So really, professionals bringing some incredibly salient points of view across here. And the content's an excerpt from their article titled "Writing for Busy Readers: Communicate More Effectively in the Real World." And I'm actually sourcing the full script there because I think it'll be a fascinating read beyond the information we actually find here. The subtitle of the article, however, Kevin, highlights an important point for us to note throughout the conversation, and namely that science suggests that while skimming is faster than reading, it also leaves us susceptible to missing information.
Absolutely. So, I mean, Craig, how do we ensure that people don't miss the essence of what's being communicated? Because, to my point about generalizing, deleting, distorting, sometimes we distort the wrong thing or we delete the wrong thing, and you're kind of going, oh, wait, I might have missed the whole point.
Yeah, that is a good point, Kevin. So the primary way to achieve this is actually to ensure the story or messaging is written in a way that demonstrates an understanding of how busy people read and how to capture their limited time and attention. And I think just listening to you, that in itself must be an art which needs to be relearned as well, because when you're presenting your case, you have to be cognizant of the fact how they're going to consume that information. So a really good link up on the other end. You then need to determine whether the idea will actually resonate with the target audience, whether, when, and how carefully the audience will actually read the messages they receive, Kevin. And every time a reader engages with a written communication, irrespective of the length or structure, they go through this 4-stage process, which is really fascinating. So firstly, they must decide whether they actually want to engage with the communication. Secondly, if they decide to engage, they must actually then decide when to engage. And then thirdly, once they decide when they engage, they must decide how much time and attention to actually allocate to reading that message. And then finally, if they're reading something that requires a response, they must then also decide whether to respond or react in that particular moment as well, Kevin. So let's take a look at the 3 points. Yes.
So I just want to add to, and you may probably touch on this some way, but especially when you first engage with information, I always get people to think of the content and the context of what you're reading. And very often, sometimes, depending, even if you're receiving information from someone, so if it's an email, if someone's talking to you, if it's a billboard, if you're reading something and you understand the context to what they're speaking to, it might make more sense. But sometimes when you forget about the context, you mislead yourself, or you misguide yourself what the response should be, because you don't know what the context of the situation
great
is.
point.
It really skews communication in a really big way. So
No,
understand the
fantastic
context
point.
and the content before making an actual response.
Absolutely, absolutely. So let's look at those 3 points, and Kevin. So starting with point one, which is actually deciding whether to engage. What we learn here is that when readers receive various forms of communication, they actually automatically assess whether the messages is worth their time at all. They consider whether they should even bother to engage with the communications. I think the word context that you used probably comes into play here. Evaluating the expected, I note this term, evaluating the expected costs and benefits of all possible choices. They then choose the option that maximizes the expected benefits and minimizes the expected costs. Busy readers constantly decide how valuable a message is without actually reading the message. And a tip is to use mental shortcuts that simplify that decision making by applying a simple rule of thumb process that, when faced with a lot of options, readers can then pick the first one that seems good enough, sometimes called satisficing, rather than applying the effort to determine the absolute best measured approach. Readers often decide on the value of communication from what is defined as the envelope, that particularly is context, the available information surrounding a communication that signals its content and, I'm sure, intent. And take note of the following examples, Kevin. So for an email, the information might be the sender or the subject line, clearly setting the context. For an office memo, it might be the title. And for a traditional letter, it might be the return address or the format of the physical envelope in itself, Kevin.
Yeah, I mean, I wanted to bring us into the last conversation, or the ending of this conversation today, Craig. But doing what I do, communication is a large part of what we do the whole time. And I was dealing with a leader the one day, and she just couldn't get herself to really understand how to communicate effectively. And she kept asking herself, but like, what if I say the wrong thing? And what if it's out of context? And one of the acronyms that I just came up with, and I said to her, you need the knack for communication, and it's the NAK. And the knack is the communication necessary? Is it adding value? And is it kind? And if you can say yes to all three of those, you can send out the communication. But if you can't, don't send it. Because very often we say adding value, and kind. And the third one is the one where we get stuck, because necessary, we always go, no, this is necessary. My team needs to know this. Is it adding value? Yes, it's adding value. Is it kind? Well, no, it's probably going to piss off some people, right? And then you're going to go, okay, cool. Maybe you have to rephrase. You've got to re-engineer how you're communicating. Because if you can cover those three bases, then you have the knack to communication. So it's a very exactly to the point,
It's a great point that, Kevin, because often, we want to respond immediately. We're really angry when we read something in an email, and you just got to go pause, come back to it at a later time, and bring the kindness back into the message. I like that.
Because if it's not kind, then you're being reactive, and if you're being reactive, you're not going to get the results. Because one of the presuppositions that we live by from a coaching perspective is the communication that you share is the response that you get.
Yes.
So if you're sharing the information in a way that is offending people and it's not the response you're getting, it means you're ineffectively communicating yourself.
And so you're not adding value.
Always comes, and you're not adding value, right? So, but I mean, Craig, what are the benefits from all the information that you've got here? So, like deciding whether to engage or not, because I think that's also a key critical factor. Sometimes not saying something is necessary as well.
Yeah, Kevin, again, this is a great conversation. So the article notes that estimating the expected benefit of a received message is only half the calculation that these busy readers make when deciding actually whether to engage with a communication or not. And what was clear is that the readers also considered how much time and effort will be required to actually engage with that communication. With the initial estimate of cost measured in both time and effort, influencing readers' decisions on whether they will engage or not. And the preference for short, easy messages makes obvious sense, but readers who are short in time and attention can at times be a little bit short-sighted and even illogical as these readers prioritize the present over the future, even stepping past the easier to read and engage articles, Kevin.
Yeah, and I don't mean to be repeating myself here, but again, when it becomes illogical, you have to kind of go back to, well, what is in context to what are you referring to? Like in context to how is this important? Like, give me the context of what you're talking about. So, because generally, when you make those shortcuts, your brain's immediately making, connection from A to B or A to C, and you're kind of going, well, why are you doing that? Because context, are you referring to the correct context of what we're talking about or what information you received? But I mean, what does point 2 tell us, Craig?
So Kevin, yeah, moving to point 2, which is deciding when to engage. The article notes that some studies have examined this want versus should decision making, which happens a lot in professional context, and it confirms that people tend to procrastinate before turning to the tasks that are more difficult and less enjoyable. And we note that when people are asked to complete a mixed set of easy and hard tasks, they typically tackle the easy tasks first. And the pattern apparently remains, even if people are offered financial incentives for prioritizing hard tasks over easy tasks. Interesting finding that. Our tendency here is to privilege the present over the future, and it means that we're often willing to pay a much higher price in order to enjoy the present right now. The point that stood out for me, however, is that just as we forgo some of those benefits to have good things now, we're also willing to incur costs to push the unpleasant things off until later. So if you write something that your intended reader thinks is going to be an arduous experience, it's guaranteed they're going to put it off to reading at a later time, Kevin.
I'm intrigued by the now and later aspect of reading. What more can you share on that, Craig?
So, Kevin, the article notes that the tendency people have, and I'm going to quote this line here, to privilege the present over the future is actually hardwired into us. And it's a really great term there. And it's a fascinating statement that definitely seems to require further research, because a group of researchers using the MRI scan capability observed that parts of the brain associated with rewards, namely the limbic reward-related regions, activate when considering options that include the described outcomes now, but most stay dormant when considering the outcomes and options described as later. And it seems that all of the cost-benefit calculations relate directly to ways in which we engage with communications we receive, but busy readers are more likely to prioritize the messages they think they can be dealt with quickly and easily, maybe because they seem more enjoyable, whereas readers will tend to avoid messages that appear long time consuming, pushing them out to read much later, Kevin.
Great, but also from an unconscious bias perspective,
yes.
Your biases play right directly into this, because what your brain's trying to do is to kind of go, well, what is the easiest and quickest way to remember stuff? What is the now that I quickly can deal with? And also, if it's too much information, my brain wants to kind of distort it to kind of go, okay, well, how can I generalize stuff and make it easier to cope with? So when it's a now kind of outcome, my brain tends to want to do it now because it's now.
Yes.
And the later kind of outcome means, okay, well, I can deal with it later. So you kind of have a skewed version or a skewed assumption that you're making about the later data. So yeah, it makes sense because your brain literally has a bias towards what's readily in front of it right now.
Brilliant.
I mean, what does point 3 tell us, Craig?
Kevin, point 3 is deciding how to engage. And it starts by telling us that everyone skims, not just time-starved readers. So I know I try and skim, I try and fast read without the necessary skills and training that you reference or mention. So definitely I can attest for the fact that, as a regular reader, even I skim. So yes, I take that as word. We also learn that busy readers aim to extract as much value as possible from the communication with as little time and attention as possible, Kevin. And to achieve this, they don't always read line by line or linearly. They have different patterns of reading to suit their goals. Both, for instance, they may closely read one section, skim over another section, and even jump around in another section, all while searching for specific information that they consider relevant. And I want to read the following paragraph verbatim, Kevin, because it really reveals some key facts around this language of economics theory, which is wonderful. Busy readers maximize the expected utility by continuously trying to predict whether the value of spending on something else. Simple as that. Readers don't intentionally think, okay, time to maximize my expected utility. We simply move on when we get bored or distracted. Our conscious focus is constantly at risk of distraction. We can learn a lot of valuable information in the first few seconds spent reading a message, but soon we reach that point of diminishing returns. At least that's our common expectation.
I mean, Craig, with all the skimming and jumping around, like we obviously now we've chatted about, when content is missed. So what are the findings on that?
Okay, yeah. So Kevin, for me, it's not just content. Obviously, in reality, the essence and meaning of the content's also missed, which at the end of the day leads to great misunderstanding and misrepresentation, or at least misinterpretation of the content or messages being represented. And what we note here is that when people read to extract as much information as possible while expecting as little time and attention as possible, the risk is that the value of the message may only be realized if they read it in full. And in this instance, the whole may be greater than the sum of the individual parts. And I think this plays very much into the point that if you're writing with intent to achieve this desired outcome, you need to know how to write that particular messaging construct so that people can pull out the information as quickly as possible without losing much in the process, Kevin.
So, I mean, Craig, as we in today's chat and we wrap it up, what are the key points for our listeners that we can share today?
Kevin, the key takeaway points are from another article, this one titled How to Skim, which was published on umass.edu, which is an online portal for the Public Research University of Massachusetts in Dartmouth. And the article opens by noting that skimming is getting the essence from reading material without reading all the words, and it boils down to knowing what parts to read and what parts to pass by. And there were 7 key takeaway points noted here, Kevin. The first is know what you want. Before you start skimming, ask yourself, what do you want to get from the book or article you're reading? Think of 2 or 3 terms that describe what you want to know, and as you skim, keep an eye out for those 2 or 3 terms. So really great point there. The second is to read vertically as well as horizontally. So when skimming, you move your eyes vertically as much as you move your eyes horizontally. In other words, you move your eyes down the page as much as you're moving them from side to side. The third point is think like an author, and I really like this one. Every article, book, or web page is written to make a point of some kind, and if you can detect the author's strategies for making his point, you can separate the importance from the unimportant material in the course of your reading, and you can focus on the original meaningful material and skip over that material that just supports the author's argument without advancing it. And fourth point here is pre-read before you start skimming. Another really good point. Examine the article before you read it. By pre-reading an article, you skim. You can pinpoint the parts of the article that require your undivided attention and the parts that you can skip. That way you can lose less. Point 5, try to detect the main idea in the introductory paragraphs. The introductory paragraphs usually express the main idea, present the argument or goal of an article or chapter. Read these paragraphs closely as they tell you what the author's aim is, which can help you decide early on actually whether you want the article or chapter is worth reading in detail at all. Point 7 is read the first sentence in each paragraph. The introductory sentence of each paragraph usually describes what follows the paragraph. So when you skim, read the first sentence in each paragraph and then decide whether the rest of the paragraph deserves a read. If it doesn't, move on. I really appreciated that point. And then the final takeaway point here is don't necessarily read complete sentences. When skimming, you don't have to read complete sentences. If the start of a sentence does not give you the information you want, skip it and move to the next sentence. Read the start of sentences with the intention of noting whether it will provide useful information, reading all the way through only if they appear to be useful at first glance, Kevin. And key for me is knowing how to shape the storytelling knowing that readers are going to skim the content, and just that is a skill that would be fantastic to have. And those are the key takeaway points for today's conversation, Kevin.
Greg, so just one of the things that you mentioned there is the intention of noting whether it will provide useful information. So
yes,
what's so important about this is very often, and that's why sometimes we struggle to read, because I know a lot of people who struggle to read. But secondly, you also have to know what is your preference to learning. So sometimes you're auditory, sometimes you're visually driven, and depending on that could also have an impact on how you're skimming information or whether you're actually skimming the right information. I was just looking as a quote for the ending of today from Jim Rohn saying, effective communication is 20% of what you know and 80% of how you feel about what you know. And it speaks to intention. For me, it speaks to intention about if you're intending to want to learn something, go there with that intention, because how you set up your brain to learn anything is in any case going to distinguish or decipher whether you're going to learn much or not learn much. So it starts with how the intention of how you want to show up for that moment as well.
Setting your own context.
Exactly. And when you're sitting down and you've prepared to go through a set of information and documents, and you prime your brain to want to learn, your brain generally learns. But when you're just randomly sitting, on the car train or doing a thing and sort of brushing through something, it's going to be a very different learning experience. So you also have to have like a bit of self-awareness of what it is you're doing and how important this information is to you. Because if it's a very important document, you might not want to just skim, and you might want to skim 2 or 3 times and kind of get your context right. And I love that. Craig, thank you so much. Thank you for giving us some insight on skimming. I love that, and very useful from storytelling last week, guys. So go and check out both of these chats to give you some insights on just upskilling yourself in the workspace. Craig, thank you so much. Have a fantastic week, and I will chat to you next week.
Yeah, thank you too, Kevin. Thanks.